Monday is the 100th anniversary of the actual Chinese Republican Revolution in 1911, which is quite an historic day because it was modeled on the idea was to create a republic in China modeled absolutely on the United States of America. And that's what we're going to look at. What we're going to look at this afternoon, this is quite good news. Actually, I'll just start with this. Can you turn? You can turn the lights off. Does anybody recognize that statue?
Yes.
Come on, New Yorkers.
Madison Square Park.
That's it. Right, Madison Square. William Seward. He was a U.S. Senator. He was, of course, Abraham Lincoln's vice president. He was also injured in the assassination attempt. U.S. Senator from New York, governor of New York. But
Can everybody put their
turn the phones off. Okay, anyway. So this is 1852. The United States is nothing. I mean, we're barely a country. This is going into the Civil War. And he gets up and gives a speech in the U.S. Senate saying, who doesn't see that every year the European commerce, European politics, European thoughts and activity, although actually gaining in greater force, and European connections, although actually becoming more intimate, will nevertheless ultimately sink in importance, while the Pacific Ocean, its shores, its islands, the vast regions beyond, will become the chief theater of events in the world's greatest hereafter. So that's what he's asserting, right? And the good news here, which I'm going to go through in some detail this afternoon, and it's details that most Americans have absolutely no idea of whatsoever, is that the reality is, over the last 200 years in the history of our republic, and before that, as the United States goes up, China goes up. If the United States goes down, China goes down, right? If China goes up, the United States goes up. And if China goes down, the United States goes down. That is the fate of this republic, and this is what the oldest, most continuous culture in the world are intimately connected. And there's a reason for that. And that's what we're going to look at, and it's an absolutely fascinating story, and the implications of that today. This is, what I want to do is just spend a couple minutes quickly just to give the background and remind everybody where the United States Republic came from, which is, of course, this extraordinary renaissance that came out of Europe in response to the collapse of civilization, which was the Dark Age in the 14th century, and the spread of the Black Death. And this is Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa. Within a few weeks, probably around Thanksgiving period, we're going to do a much more in-depth presentation on why we say this man in 1435 was the founder of modern science and the architect of what became the American Republic. Right, and so that we're going to go through that. Obviously not going to do that today. And instead of me blabbing about it, it just so happens that on Tuesday, in LaRouche's discussion in Virginia with our staff there in the basement team, toward the end of the discussion, someone read a beautiful quote, Leander Bernstein, from the American Philosophical Society from 1790, how Russia and the United States is going to be the future, that alliance based on science and the progress of mankind. And LaRouche said, well, let me just embellish that a bit, and I'm just going to play this because it's much better than what I would say, probably. Where is it? There he is.
In the modern history of mankind, since the aftermath of the Dark Age, the birth of civilization, and this process that led to the creation of the United States is associated largely with Nicholas of Cusa, which we have done a lot of work on. Helga spent a lot of effort on this stuff with the leading experts on Cusa. I've been involved with this also from a similar standpoint. That the actual genesis of the United States occurred with the process leading into the Council of Florence, the great ecumenical Council of Florence. Now, what happened was that the Venetian powers, which are always the evil ones, and it's a real continuation of the Roman Empire with the Venetian system. For example, the British Empire was based on the new Venetian system. And the new Venetian system was what the problem was in the history of Europe. This is what crushed the Massachusetts Bay Colony, was crushed by the new Venetian system. And the genesis of the United States goes back to the founding at Plymouth. But the Massachusetts Bay Colony was the vehicle which established this. Now, you had the crushing of this, of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and Franklin was told to go get out of here and go down south, and they went eventually to Pennsylvania. And what was done in Pennsylvania was actually the development there on the legacy of Cusa and Company, who created the Americas. It was the work of Cusa that actually was crucial in the founding of the Americas. And so this process of physical science, which Cusa was a particularly part of it, a key part of it, the development of physical science, development of everything that is the United States was what? That Europe was, as Cusa understood, Europe was degenerating, even despite the Renaissance. And Cusa's instruction was to his friends, we must cross the oceans to establish a civilization which is a continuation of our devotion on other continents. And that was the birth. Columbus, for example, was acting on the instruction of Cusa. Cusa by that point was dead. But Columbus was actually a student of the work and devoted to the work of Nicholas of Cusa. And this is what, there was this thing, the Spanish colonization failed because the Habsburgs were running the Spanish culture. That's why the Spanish culture is sick in the Americas still today. It's because of this problem. And so it was the development of this science driver program, the cultural program, which was based on European culture at that time, but based in the North America, which was the center of this operation. And with the crushing of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the leadership moved into the Pennsylvania-centered area. And we've done a lot of work, our organization's done a lot of work on this history since that time. And it is that history which goes back especially to the Renaissance, to the European Renaissance, the Great Ecumenical Council of Florence. Went back to there, is the foundation of civilization. What happened then is you had European culture was brought across to North America in particular, because the Habsburg effect on the Spanish-speaking part was disastrous. So what you had is European culture was brought away from Europe into the Americas, and particularly North America. And it was that, essentially from 1620 on, up to the time of the victory in 1782, up until that time, that created in North America the culture of the United States. It was the fact of a continuing devotion to this mission to bring European culture free of Europe into North America that established what became the United States. It was that, especially from 1620 until the victory at Yorktown, that the American Revolution was made possible in a way that Lafayette did not understand. Lafayette did not understand that you cannot just take a bunch of Frenchmen and take them out and make a successful revolution like North America. It was a cultural devotion of taking the best of European culture, moving it across the border to North America, creating what became the United States, was the basis for our revolution. We've now extended that to people from other parts of the world, which is largely Lincoln played a key role in that part of the process. But no, that history, understood in those terms, is key. That's what we depend upon. That's the depth of this nation. The depth of the soul of this nation is that.
Okay, so I think that's pretty clear. Again, we're going to go through more of this in detail in a few weeks. That's the map, the Tuscanelli map that was used. You can see they thought, of course, they were going to China, supposedly. I guess they probably did. In the United States, it's right there in the middle. Of course, that's what they ran into with Columbus.
You mean the yellow is his map?
Yeah, the yellow is the Tuscanelli map. And then they have superimposed in here the United States. And that's not unimportant because this is a funny little thing. This is if the physical size of a country were the size of its population, that's what this map is. This is about 1,500. You see this skinny little stuff over here.
Yeah.
And of course, it's clear. I mean, this is where the people are. And so if you understand that the individual human mind is the source of physical wealth, then you're going to go where the raw materials are, the people. And that's where the people are. And that's where you go. And of course, that was the whole idea of the mission. And when they came here, they found this wonderful continent, which we could occupy instead. And you may remember Diane referring to this last week. This is Leibniz. Toward the end of his life, he was completely impassioned by this question of the role of China, specifically, in the dialogue between China and European culture as the basis for the future of mankind. This is the journal that he edited. You remember she talked about the fact that he thought that she should have all these Chinese people come to Europe, to teach people about some old ideas and civilization. And of course, this is important because it's Leibniz who is the philosophical founder of the United States, of the U.S. Constitution and Declaration of Independence, way before, after he dies, and who was involved here in intervening in England and with networks here in the pre-United States, right, at the turn between going into the 18th century, 1700. Which created the basis for the Western development of the nation. That's a whole story which Graham Lowry told about in How the Nation Was Won. People can read the book. So again, but this is central to the whole thing. So what I want to do, this is just a lot of fun. Because again, it's stuff that nobody knows anything about, and I knew nothing about until a few years ago. This is 1776, and everybody knows what happens in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. And of course, that's a profound development for mankind with the establishment of the United States. But while this was happening, something else was going on too in 1776, which was the last voyages of Captain Cook. Now, how many people have heard of Captain Cook? Yeah, okay, most people, yeah, right. You learned that in school, I guess, right? And the last voyages of Captain Cook focused on the Pacific Basin and the South Pacific, but specifically here. Right, which was the discovery, or the chartering of, probably somebody knew it was there, of what we call the Sandwich Island, which of course is Hawaii, and an extensive exploration of the Bering Straits.
Yeah.
So this is all, now, and he got killed in the Sandwich Islands. I don't know the whole story.
Which is
Some kind of
why.
conflict there with the natives. Well, that could be. That very well could be. He was English, of course. But here's something that's just totally fascinating. So these are two books that were written about the last voyages of Captain Cook. And the one on the left here was published in London, right, in 1781. You see, it's Journal of Captain Cook's Last Voyage to the Pacific, blah, blah. That's basically all it says. The one on the right was written by an American named John Ledyard, right, and published 2 years later in 1783 in Hartford, Connecticut. And what does he say? He says, what's the title? What's the subject here? Journal of Captain Cook's Last Voyage to the Pacific Ocean and in quest of a northwest passage between Asia and America. So that's what we're interested in, right? And so Ledyard was on this expedition, and this just gives you some idea of the level of investigation that they made of the coast of the Bering Straits. They were very interested in this. Where were the islands? How could the passage work? Et cetera. You can see the Pacific Basin here, the Bering Straits, Sandwich Islands, Hawaii. Whoops. Yeah. Okay. So that's Ledyard. I won't go through all the details. It's just a fascinating guy. It's just a typically American story. He's from Connecticut, which is a whole tradition going back to the Winthrops as like the centerpiece of the building of the Republic, coming out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony that LaRouche was referring to. Anyway, he's a wild guy. He's the first one that sails up the Connecticut River to the Sound, in a boat. And when he's a young man, he wants to explore. So at that point, we don't have a navy or anything. We're not even a country yet. We're not a nation yet. So he goes to London and he jumps in one of these British exploratory ships. So of course, at that point, you're subject to the laws. I think actually he ends up getting pulled into the British Navy. So the revolution breaks out, and there he is caught in the British Navy. So when his warship docks in Huntington Bay here in Long Island, he jumps ship, right, and escapes, and then comes into New York. And he immediately walks into the networks of the core of this is like 1781, so it's at the end of the revolution. Now, what's his idea? What's he going to do? Okay, before we even have a nation, this is before the Constitutional Convention and the Constitution in 1789, we barely ended the war of the revolution. So here's what he's going to do. He's organizing an expedition from Hamburg, Germany to Virginia. Okay? Now most people go from Hamburg to Virginia, across the Atlantic Ocean. That's how you go from Hamburg to Virginia. Not John Ledyard. Oh no, we're not doing that. Right? We're not doing that. We're going to go up to the Baltic countries, through Europe, all the way across the Siberia, Russia, all the way up to the Bering Straits, across the Bering Straits, Alaska, down the west coast of the United States, across. So this is what he's going to do. And he's going to prove that this is the way to go. This is how you have to think about the world. And he actually gets to Siberia, and there's some kind of intrigue, and for some reason, people around Catherine the Great have him arrested. I'm sure it was just some kind of an operation that was run. So he never completed it, but he almost did. He got halfway anyway. But he gives you the idea. This is how we were thinking. This is Robert Morris. He was the financier of the American Revolution, and kind of on the inside of working with Washington and the Patriots to establish the country. They then came up with another scheme. Because the whole idea is, how do we get from here? We're not a nation yet. We just have these 13 states. Okay? How do we get from here into where all the people are? That we recruit to this great American revolutionary project. So they got one scheme where they're going to go around South America, and they're going to stop here in Vancouver, and they're going to go up to the Bering Straits, and they're going to go through Hawaii. And none of this actually happens because they don't have the money to do it. Because we're not. It's before the Constitution. There's no national bank. We can't finance these kinds of things. He tries to raise money to do that. But this is how we're thinking. And this is my favorite quote, which people have seen, I think, before. John Quincy Adams. Now remember, okay, during all this period that I'm telling you about, 1782, 83, where is this guy, right? He's 12, 13 years old. He's with his dad in France during the Revolution. Then he's 14 years old. He goes with Dana to Russia. So he's part of the official, this 14-year-old kid is part of the official delegation to Russia to get the Russians to recognize the independence of the United States. So his whole orientation is the entire world and the American Revolution. And he says, of course, this is a speech he gave on July 4th, 1821. He says, in the conflict of 7 years, the history of the war by which he's talking to military veterans, by which you maintained that declaration became the history of the civilized world. It was the first solemn declaration by a nation of the only legitimate foundation of civil government. It was the cornerstone of a new fabric destined to cover the surface of the globe. It demolished and destroyed the lawfulness of all governments founded upon conquest. It swept away all the rubbish of accumulated centuries of servitude. From the day of this declaration, the spirit of North America were no longer the people of North America were no longer the fragment of a distant empire, imploring justice and mercy from an inexorable master in another hemisphere. They were a nation asserting as of right and maintaining by war its own existence. The nation was born in a day. It stands and must forever stand alone, a beacon on the summit of the mountain to which all the inhabitants of the earth may turn their eyes for a genial and saving light, a light of salvation and redemption to the oppressed. So that's a cornerstone of a new fabric destined to cover the surface of the globe, okay? That's the idea. That once that declaration is declared, that's a change in the physical principle of the noosphere, of the entire planet, in fact, of the galaxy, because it's a shift in the identity of what a human being is. And that's what he understood from a scientific standpoint. And they followed suit on this. This is what wasn't just a nice speech. He, along with John Jay and these guys, Boudinot, people that know some of the work we've done in Paterson, he was critical with working with Alexander Hamilton and the creation of Paterson as an industrial city. This guy, Frelinghuysen, they set up something in 1810 called the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. Now, this is a really ingenious little idea because the only way you're going to get Americans into Asia, which is run by the British Empire, right, the coast of China, Thailand, and India, etc. You're not going to just walk in and say, hi, we're Americans, and we're here to teach about the American Revolution. Those guys over there, the British, they're the bad guys, and it ain't going to work, okay? So they do it as a missionary movement, because who's going to stop you from going in there and, hey, we're just here to spread Christianity, and, you know, etc., which they did do. It wasn't like it was a fraud or something. These were profoundly religious people. But that was the way that we were immediately, again, this is 1810, all right? So we're barely a nation, but we're going to immediately spread the revolution into the east, or go west. This is the first head of the ABCFM was the father of Samuel FB Morse. And his name was Jedediah, funny name, Jedediah Morse. So Samuel FB Morse grew up with this idea. And I just wanted to show this quickly to give you an idea how these people thought. Because their biggest first project was with the Native Americans. So they had a completely different view of Native Americans than you're taught Americans have of they're saying, oh, well, Americans, you know, we exploited the Indians. That was a British operation. We didn't do that. And what he said was this. Look at this, is really great. The mental quality of the Native Americans are not in the least inferior to those of the Europeans. They are capable of all, even the most abstract sciences, and if equal care were taken of their education, we would see rise among them, the Native Americans, philosophers, mathematicians, and divines who would rival the first of Europe. Boy, is that American or what? But they also recognized that there was something fascinating in this, even though it had degenerated in the Native American culture, that clearly was tied to Asia, right? And so this was a whole project, and that's where they really, a lot of the ABCFM work started, was right here in the United States. Now, this just gives you a map. This is the missions from 1810 to 1860. And in the last years of reading through and reading the memoirs of these people, I must say, these are some of the most extraordinary unsung heroes of the history of our country. I mean, they're just absolutely extraordinary people. And in some cases, you know, their lives were cut short because of their idea, we're going to go in and we're going to recruit these people to the American Revolution. This is the couple that first went to Hawaii, Hiram Bingham and his wife Sybil. Dan Beach Bradley. Everybody remember The King and I? Yeah. The musical? Okay, that was based on what he did. It's a guy named King Munga in Thailand. He's the one that was sent to Thailand. David Abiel from New Jersey. He was, you know, you can see 1804 to 1846. These people, he didn't live too long. He was sick, but he was our first guy that went into China, into southern China. And he ended up working with this guy, Walter Macon Lowry, who was murdered by the British, although it was done through, you know, pirates, right? And he would work with the, but anyway, you can see, look at this, see, I don't know if people can see this. This is a map of the United States, and this is a list of all of the operations that were right inside the United States with the Native Americans. And then here's a list of where India, Turkey, China, you know, etc. I can't even read what that says. Anyway, and you can see, you got Hawaii, Japan, Thailand, and then you have all this stuff in Asia Minor, India. So this is an extensive operation. And all this shows is that people here stateside had the same idea. I've showed this before. That's Philemon Dickerson, who was the president of the Paterson Hudson Railroad, the first major railroad that went from Paterson down to the Hudson River. And he said so they break in the, you know, they're doing the ceremony where they, whatever you call it, you know, what do you call it, the groundbreaking. He gives a speech about this little teeny railroad. That's how long is that, right? 30 miles or something. So he says well, you know, this is the first link of a great chain which is going to bind the western part of New York State, and who's going to charge me with extravagance if I say this chain, you know, has to go thousands of miles west to the extreme limits of our territory. So nobody thought of, we're just going to build a little railroad here. This was always the idea. We're going west, 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 west. And then this is list, it's even more explicit. 1827, he's of course the German economist who comes here and works with the Quincy Adams people and the Army Corps of Engineers to build the railroads and the canals. And he says, Ohio will soon be as populous as Pennsylvania, Indiana as Ohio, and Illinois as Indiana. They will pass over the Mississippi, we're going to go over the Mississippi, next the Rocky Mountains, and at last turn their faces to China instead of England. Pennsylvania and all eastern middle states can increase in population, arts and sciences, etc. So he's explicit, you know, we're going to dump the British Empire, the English, the British, and we're going to go west. So the way that they had this set up, this is their main recruitment school was in Connecticut. It's called the Cornwall School. It's a little teeny town northwest Connecticut. It's still there. It's called Cornwall, Connecticut. And just so you know, the MO was that they would pick up castaways, you know, or people, young men, predominantly, who had been shipwrecked or what have you at sea from these different nations, because you couldn't always get into these countries. So this man was picked up as a young boy by the Americans, Manjiro, and he was taught English, he was Japanese. And it's critical because he became the basis of the Meiji Restoration, which brought the American system into Japan. This guy, Henry Obukayu, was a young, I don't know how old he was when you know, he was picked up by the Americans, maybe 12 or something, 13. He was from the Sandwich Islands, from Hawaii. And they would bring him to the school, and they would teach them English, Greek, Latin, history, science, mathematics, etc., the whole gamut. This is a totally American idea, right? You wouldn't, you know. And Hawaii, for obvious reasons, if you look at the map, this was clear that this had to be the center of these operations, because it's halfway between, you know, or kind of halfway between the United States and Asia. You could have this as the center of operations. Everybody stops there, right? And if anybody's doing Pacific Ocean navigation or trade, it's a place where people stop and, you know, take on supplies and water, etc. So it's a great intelligence post. So that's the first major place that we go, that this ABC-FM goes in 1819. This is Hiram and Sybil Bingham, another one sent it. Remember, they're walking into something that's just these natives where, you know, a few years, 20 years, 30 years, whatever it is earlier, had murdered Captain Cook, essentially. I mean, this is pretty ambitious for a couple of young people. They're probably in their 20s. And they're going to bring the American Revolution here to this place. And they set up a mission. And what they had done on the way over on the ship with that guy I showed you, Obukayu, is they took the time of however long it is, it's a pretty long voyage, and they created a written Hawaiian language. It was just spoken. So they worked with this guy and they created a written language. So when they got there, they could actually begin printing things and teaching, especially the children, how to write their own language. And so by 1834, they have a newspaper, which is the first Hawaiian newspaper, where people can, because they, you know, had enough time to basically teach people the language. Of course, you always start with the kids. You start educating the children. And this is just absolutely flabbergasting if you look at this. So this is the weapons, okay? That's the printing press. That's our weapon. That's our main arsenal there. Now look at this, right? I just love this. So this is this whole period of the 19th century. And what this goes through is how many pages were printed by all the various missions around the world in the United States. Goodness. 1,176,831,056 pages of various things. Bibles, textbooks, etc. So that's a lot of pages printed. And this is just by the ABC-FM and their various operations. So anyway, it's pretty clear what their intentions are. So this is the guy, Daymond, Samuel Daymond, who becomes the, I think in 1834, he's brought into Hawaii after the Binghams do what they do. And he's the guy that runs the joint for the Americans. And it's a very important role. Anyway, I won't go through the details on that, but his son, right there, Frank Daymond, will become extremely important later. He's the guy that basically meets Sun Yat-sen, the father of the Chinese Republic. Okay, so just briefly, now again, it's important to realize that this is all complete embattled conditions. I mean, the British East India Company runs the Pacific. The Royal Navy runs the Pacific, right? You don't just go in and start doing things without running into conflict. Of course, at that point, you know, this is on the eve of the First Opium War. So opium is flooding into China from India as part of this global slave, dope, free trade empire. So China's just being decimated, completely destroyed. And so the first American to get in there is this guy, David Abeel, from New Brunswick, New Jersey. And he goes over there in 1835 or something like that, and then goes back. And he runs into what at that point is the resistance against this destruction of China. It happens to be the old Confucian scholars who are in the southern part of the country, in this case Fujian province. And so that's this guy, Xu Jiyu, right? And so they immediately just bond. And Abeel sits down with this guy, and they have just hours and hours and hours and hours of discussion, with Abeel giving a whole briefing of the world and what happened with its founding in the United States and how we beat the British Empire, you know, the whole thing. So the result of this is he writes, Xu Jiyu, the Chinese guy, he comes out in 1848. For the first time ever in modern, maybe ever, he puts, it's called a brief atlas of the world. And he takes all of this knowledge that Abeel had given him, and he writes a history, right, of the last, whatever, few hundred years of the West. And then it's an atlas with a whole bunch of maps and stuff. Here, I'll just show you this thing. That's his map of of North America. And of course, he creates names for the countries, because there's no Chinese names for these countries. In many cases, they're just phonetic. You know, the Chinese characters that, there's a European map. The maps are all very accurate. I mean, obviously they're not navigable, accurate, or whatever, but in terms of borders, this is great. It's the United States. Got all the states, Mississippi River. Yeah, yeah. So that's very precise, right? Anyway, I'll just go back into this quickly because this is really fun. So what he writes in here, Xu Jiyu, the Chinese guy, he talks about George Washington, and he says in here, he says, I won't read all the quotes, I'll just read but he says in here, he goes, my God, this guy is just extraordinary. And he rivals the great ancients of China, which is almost a heretical thing to say, right? But he says, this guy is so extraordinary, he's even as good as the ancients that we look back to, right? He says, of all the famous Westerners of ancient and modern times, can Washington be placed in any position but first? The Americans have not established titles of kings and counts. They don't follow the rules of succession. The public organs are entrusted to public opinion. There's never been a system of this sort in ancient or modern times. This is really wonderful. This is great, right? This is not good news for the British in China. Okay, bad news. No good. You don't want this. So that's 1848. This is, okay, to get the idea. Remember, 1852 is when Seward gives that speech in the Senate about the future of the world as an agent. These are the maps again. And I just throw this in here, but it's typical of the same thing. Does anybody know who that is? Lin Zishu? I know you. You don't count. You're a ringer. Who is? Okay, you can tell people who it is.
He was the official in charge of, I think, overseeing the collection of taxes
Right.
from the British, or he
No.
was in charge of the trade
Right.
in southern China.
Right.
At the time, just preceding the Opium War,
Right.
and he was resisting,
Right.
and he resisted the British attempt to bring the opium in.
Right.
You know, he tried to shut down the
He did, yeah, he did more than that. You're right. What he did is he actually ordered all the opium to be collected.
Yeah.
Remember, this was property of the foreigners, of the British, etc. So he got rid of all the opium, but it was on, as far as he was concerned, Chinese, sovereign Chinese soil. So we're going to collect it all, and he burned it, all of it. He destroyed it. He obliterated it, and this led to the first Opium War. But anyway, he was an extraordinary person. But it shows you the level of resistance. I haven't done the work on his direct contact with us and the Americans, but I'm sure it's there.
There's a statue of him in Chinatown.
Yeah. In here in Chinatown?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Bowery, next to the big apartment building on Bowery Street.
Confucius Plaza?
Confucius Plaza.
Oh, really? Okay, I didn't realize that. Is that new?
No.
Oh, okay. Anyway, so this is bad news for the British Empire, because what's happening is that, and you have also similar things going on, although not yet it's developed with Russia. The American Revolution is, as John Quincy Adams laid out, beginning to spread its fabric across the entire surface of the globe. And this is obviously death for them. And there is an offensive, and a counteroffensive in the 1840s, in the 1850s. This is Palmerston, Queen Victoria, right? Napoleon III in France. And this is they deliberately provoked the Crimean War to destabilize Russia and destabilize the underbelly, what they call the soft underbelly of Russia. Right? This is the collapsing out of an empire, and they don't want the Russians to have control of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and so they start a whole war, right? And then you have 1860, as part of the Second Opium War, the British and the French sack the Summer Palace in Beijing, and they destroy, they just take they steal everything. You know, it's probably all the stuff in the British Museum. That's usually what they did anyway. And within a few months of that happening, in April 1861, Fort Sumter is attacked by the British-backed Confederacy. So their intention is to completely obliterate any nation state on the planet and anything that's going with this American revolutionary idea. This just underscores it. This is you can see this is a cartoon from 1863. It shows John Bull, the British Empire, Napoleon III, and they're looking across, I guess, from Europe across the ocean. And the British say to Napoleon, "Can you recognize that thing they call the CSA?" So this is a guy here holding a Confederate States of America flag, jumping up and down. Says, "Hello!" And Napoleon says, "Oh, I think I could if it weren't for that big fellow who stands in front." And of course, it's Abraham Lincoln standing blocking the view. So it's pretty explicit. This is, people knew this. This is not some big secret. This is a cartoon from the same period, just showing how, how the British look down on the Chinese. You see the Chinese guy, he looks like a monkey. They make him look like a monkey. And it's Lord Elgin.
They make everybody look like a monkey.
Yeah, that's, well, except them. Come knuckle down, no shooting this time, you're going to obey our orders. And this is a map which you can't see the details of, but it just goes through. I mean, they were basically tearing China apart. And assisted by the complete decadence of that Qing dynasty, too. So I have to say, it's, this is not a good situation. Okay, so in the middle of all this is an extremely important person. Some people actually may have heard of this man, and there's a school right down in Chinatown called Yunwing School. It's an elementary school. He was the first Chinese to graduate from an American university. His name is Yunwing. That's his Cantonese name. Rong Hung is the Mandarin name. He graduated from Yale University in 1854. And he became the liaison between the Lincoln people and the American nationalists and similar people in China for most of his life. He died in 1912. And the fun story is, as part of trying, remember, this is the Civil War's going on, in the United States. China's being torn apart with this British-French operation, the Taiping Wars. So these guys, the Chinese, the nationalists, the patriots say, man, we got to do something. We got to arm ourselves. We have to strengthen the country. So there's a group, a movement in China called the self-strengthening movement. It's a whole history in of itself. And the idea is that you build an actual modern industry, you have a way to build your own weaponry. And Young Wing is sent to the United States to buy machinery so they could start a machine tool industry to produce, especially at that point, guns, right, inside China against this attack. And he goes to Fitchburg, Massachusetts. That's where he gets the machines from. Anyway, the funny story is, though, is that when he's there, he is so moved by what's happening in the Civil War that he goes down to the Union Army headquarters, the recruiting office, to volunteer. He wants to join. He said, that's it, I'm going to join. I want to be part of this. And of course, they say, you can't. You weren't born here. You know, you're not a citizen. You can't join the Union Army. Thanks a lot. We really appreciate it. But, you know, this was not uncommon, by the way. It happened in Hawaii, too. Right? The Hawaiian people would march down to, you know, Daymond and say, where do I sign up for the Union Army? And they're, you know, you can't. We're sorry. You're not a citizen. This is called the Jiangnan Arsenal. This was designed by Americans. It's based on West Point, the Occult Polytechnique. This is across the Yangtze from, you know, the mouth of the Yangtze River near Shanghai. And it was an arsenal. Back then, an arsenal meant you had your own machining capability to make guns, to make weapons. You had to study science, artillery, geometry, etc. So this was the project that Young Wing was involved in, of actually building a nation state. So what happens is, of course, we win the Civil War. And one of the first things that's done is the United States seeks to make sure that the government of China, whatever it is, whatever, maybe it's degenerate, etc., but must be recognized as a sovereign government. And no empire has any right to go in there and say, we're going to run you. Right? And this is done by the U.S. government, and this guy, Anson Burlingame, who was appointed as like the special plenipotentiary to the Chinese government. And they succeed in getting a treaty, which is passed in the U.S. Senate in 1868. And the treaty basically says China has the right to this, its own ports, etc. That is, and you know, we have what power do we have to enforce this, right?
Right.
But it doesn't matter, because it's principle, right? Because, you know, you still have Hong Kong, the British will run Hong Kong, etc. But this is a description of the treaty from one of the ABCFM missionaries, William Spear. And this is, get how he thinks about this, right? He says, while slavery existed in the United States, the Senate would not have ratified a national covenant, i.e. this treaty, which accords so freely the rights of equal humanity and equal civilization to a tawny race, not of European blood. That covenant will be kept with good faith on our part. It is in harmony with the article of the Constitution recently adopted, the 14th Amendment, which says that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of its laws. This article, that is the 14th Amendment, we accept as the text of the Constitution, of which this treaty is but one example. All right, you get the idea. In other words, they're looking at the victory of the Civil War, the affirmation of the Constitution, so they immediately move on this idea of recognizing China as a sovereign country. And then what happens is, they turn this into a big to-do. It's a real, you know, screw you to the British. So Burlingame takes a delegation of this Chinese government, and they basically take their little treaty, and you saw the Chinese language version, that was the Chinese language version of the treaty. Anyway, and they do a trip around the world to go to all the European capitals. So they walk and say, okay guys, here we got a little treaty here. And I have no idea how this was received, or, you know, it's just like completely, you know, this is the way the world's gonna be run, damn it, you know? And what they do is they have a ceremony in Beijing, the capital, and the guy I was telling you about earlier that did the maps, Xu Jiyu, during this whole period of the British-French occupation, he was in exile, he had to flee into the countryside, you know, etc. And he was, as soon as we won the Civil War, and established the Burlingame Treaty, he was brought back in. Burlingame brought him back into Beijing to honor him, to give him an award, and to make sure he was there at the ceremony of the treaty. And he presented him with a painting by Gilbert Stuart of Washington. So he was given an actual painting by Gilbert Stuart of George Washington as a gift. And I won't read this now, but he basically says in here something quite extraordinary, which is that, actually I'll read just a section of it. Here, let me just go to this one. Anyway, what he says is, he says that why here, this is the part I want to read, all right? Okay, he's talking about Washington. His life and character were such as peculiarly commend him to your countrymen. Like them, he honored agriculture. Like them, he was for peace, and only fought in defense of his country. Like them, he believed that every man is entitled to inspiration, fair opportunity. Like them, he held to the doctrine of Confucius, spoken 2,300 years ago, quote, we should not do to others what we would not that others should do to us. This great truth came to Washington, not negatively, but positively from divinity itself, as a command unto him, quote, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. So, why should we not exchange our thoughts, that is Chinese and American? Why should we not have the moral maxims of Confucius and Mencius and you, the sublime doctrines of Christianity? Why should we not take our charming manners, your temperance, your habits of scholarship, your charming manners, and your high culture, and you, our modern sciences, our railroads, our telegraphs, and our steamboats? Why should not this great nation, the mother of inventions, whence comes paper, printing, porcelain, compass, gunpowder, and the great doctrine of the people are the source of the power. That's Tian Chao Wei Gong, that's what this is. That's from Confucius. I think that's on the statue, the Confucius statue here in Chinatown. Follow up their inventions and principles and enjoy them in all their development. Why should not the discoverers of coal have the same wealth, have the wealth and strength derived from its use, and those who made the first watertight vessels guided by a compass use the great steamers whose swiftness makes us your near neighbors and which carry 1,000 men on their decks? I present this portrait with all goodwill in the name of the people of the United States, hoping it may ever recall to you and yours their enduring friendship for your country and their love and regard for you, its worthy representative. So that's at the. Anyway, year earlier, our friend Senator Seward had purchased Alaska. Everybody thought that, you know, supposedly everybody thought he was crazy and this was Sewards Folly. And anybody that knew anything knew exactly what we were doing with this, right? So again, coming off the victory in the Civil War, again, we're going to aggressively pursue this move westward. This is William Spear. I won't say a lot about this, but this book, coming right off the Burlingame Treaty, 1870, called The Oldest and Newest Empire, China and the United States. This is like a 700-page book. And everything you want to know about China is in this book, and it's sold like hotcakes. I don't know how many, but you know, because people, especially in California, because people knew nothing about China, and it's a good book. I mean, it tells about history and Confucius and the whole thing. And this guy is single-handedly responsible for, you know, the laws that allow Chinese people to finally become U.S. citizens. There's a whole story to this, and it ultimately bears upon the future of China and Yat-sen. Anyway, so then of course we get into the Centennial Expedition, which we talked a little bit about last week, which became the center of anybody, you know, a exhibition for people to come from all over the world and to see this extraordinary development, which was the American Republic, with the technology and the machines and the infrastructure, etc. And There was, of course, a Chinese exhibition, which is here and here. Now, Yung Wing, the guy that was the first graduate of a Chinese graduate of the university here, made sure that part of this Chinese delegation were these young boys, these students. 100, you remember the number? 100 and some odd.
130.
Something like that, yeah. So they were there, right? And people were just completely fascinated by all this stuff. Wow, But again, you see, this is not something brand new. This is a whole process part of a whole process that's been developing. This young man would have been about that age at that time in 1876. He wasn't there, right? His name is Sun Wen, otherwise known as Sun Yat-sen. He's born in 1866. And there he is about that age, I don't know, 12 or something like that. He's born in southern China. And his brother has a sugarcane plantation in Hawaii. There's a lot of Chinese in Hawaii. And so he goes to visit his brother, and he stays there, and he goes to school, and he runs right into the American networks of Daymond, Frank Daymond. They run a Chinese boys' school in Honolulu, and that's his first encounter with the Americans, and of course he learns all about all this stuff. You know, the whole history of the development of the American Republic, etc. He goes back to China. He's still in his teens. This is a famous photo. That's him in the middle. It's called the Five Arch Rebels. So he had these young guys. They were like 16, and they were known. We're the rebels. We're gonna create a revolution in China with these ideas. And people, something like that. And so by the time he's like 17 years old, in 87 or whatever, 88, he actually has the guts. He basically goes to the Capitol and demands a meeting with Li Hongzhang, who was the guy that was in that picture with Grant. When Grant went to China, was the top Chinese minister of the government, and says, "Look, here's what you got to do. You're doing this all wrong. Forget about it." So he decides at that point, at 17 years old, I am personally going to create a nation here. It's going to happen. It's a pretty ballsy thing to do, right? But you can see where he gets the ideas from. It's an American idea. Now, the context of this, strategically, of course, is this export of the American system globally through the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Remember, we talked about this a little bit last week with Mendeleev and company. This is an advertisement for Baldwin locomotives in Russian. This is a crates of Baldwin locomotives in the docks in China. Anyway, articles, ordering American locomotives to build this interior rail lines, etc. Remember this map? Some people that were here last week remember this is from like 1890. This Gilpin map, very ambitious. They call this the Cosmopolitan Railway. You're gonna get on the railroad in New York and go across the country and up the Cosmopolitan Railway, and somehow you get over the Bering Strait, down into Asia. And this was our idea, right? We're going to smash the British geopolitical control over the planet, which is what this map shows. Right? So you have two completely different ideas of the world. And this is the British Empire. This is put out by them in like the same period, in 1900. Here's what we control. Here's the sea lanes we control. And of course, all world trade is controlled by maritime control of choke points and ports.
Yeah.
You don't see any railroads here, right? Nothing, no railroads into the interior, nothing. It's a completely different idea. So the reality is, by the turn of the century, the dawn of the new century, in 1900, the entire world is at a crossroads. Which way is it going to go? Coming out of this victory in the Civil War and the explosion of American science, technology, etc., and the export of that globally. So we're going to go the way of empire, or are we going to do this instead? And there's a series of things that happen, and this is important, and you get the idea. This is Edward VII, who is a totally degenerate lout, right? Saxe-Coburg. This is the same family as. In fact, if you look at pictures of him when he's young, he looks just like Prince Charles. And he spent his entire reign from 1901 to 1910 organizing World War I. Right, to organize all the European powers of Russia against, etc., to basically throw the entire Eurasian landmass into a cauldron, chaos and war. But you can see the view of him in France in 1903. That's
He's got his face on his butt.
yeah, I like it. Perfidious Albion is what I think that's what they say in English, right? But this is one evil dude, okay? Bad guy, no good. And as part of this, I'm not saying he did this directly, but it's definitely a British operation. The President of the United States in this period was William McKinley, who was a Civil War Lincoln Republican guy, totally anti-British Empire, anti-free trade. There's a cartoon. Right? It's President McKinley pulling them, the America, out of the swamp of despair. And this swamp of despair says free trade swamp. Right? So that's what he was known as. And he was assassinated in September of 1901. Okay, putting Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, who was a complete British asset, whose grandfather was the head of the Confederate Secret Service. So the traitors took over the United States. So this is a very sad period in the history of our country. Now, so while that's happening, what's Sun Yat-sen doing? Okay, so here he is, 1895 to 1911. This is just, he makes 5 trips around the world. 5 trips around the world from the time he's whatever age, 25 or whatever. I guess 30, right, years old. And this, it goes, he's in the United States 5 times out of those times. He goes all over. And what he's doing is he's organizing everybody around this Chinese Revolution project. The entire Chinese diaspora in all these places, but also everybody else that he runs into, any political people, France, England, America, etc. And this is and then he'd organize it in the Chinese diaspora communities, like here in New York, or San Francisco, or Tokyo. He had a secret society called Teng Meng Hui. And these were the proponents of the partisans of the idea of the Chinese Revolution. And these are pictures of him in Chicago, Vancouver, Japan. I mean, this is just so incredible to me. This guy was. All right, now, so what's happening here? So the British have taken over temporarily with TR and Wilson, okay, who are complete traitors. So they've taken over the United States for the moment. But there is a fierce resistance to this, especially inside the institution of the U.S. military, who understand that this is that us siding with the British Empire in World War I, or any time, is a complete disaster for the country. And at the end part of the 19th century, they devised a series of war plans for what they consider to be probably a pending war with the British Empire, a shooting war with the British Empire, right?
That Rutherford B. Hayes.
What's that?
Rutherford B. Hayes.
Yeah.
Operation Red.
Yeah, War Plan Red, right? But anyway, and it's a series of actual U.S. military war plans. War plan, the colors are each country is given a color. Britain is red, the United States is blue, Japan is orange. It's considered a client state of red of the British Empire, which by that point it actually was, right? Canada is crimson, Australia is scarlet, and this is the plan, right? So this is the initial phase. We invade Canada, we seize the British dominions in the Caribbean, and ultimately we go over there and we take over. I mean, this is real. This is an American war plan. This is no joke. This is the real deal. And in 1909, this very strange guy, I tell you, these are people you've never heard of, and they were like so central in keeping our country alive, right? His name is Homer Lee. But he is an author of a book called The Valour of Ignorance. The introduction by one of our top U.S. Army guys, General Abner Chafee, who was the Army Chief of Staff 1904 to 1906. He was a veteran of the Philippines. He was in China with the Boxer Rebellion, so he knew Asia. But he was also a senior military guy. And what's the Valour of Ignorance about? The Valour of Ignorance, and you can get the book, by the way, on Google Books, if you want to look at it, is how the Japanese Empire, it's War Plan Orange, is going to attack the United States. They have plans to attack the United States. This is the overall map. First, hitting Hawaii. Sound familiar? Right. The various islands. This is extraordinarily detailed. This is not just some, how you would have to defend the coastlines, how we'd have to defend the San Francisco Bay, where they would land if there was a ground invasion. So this is basically, this is 1909, okay? So people that say, well, Roosevelt knew that the Japanese, everybody knew that they were going to do it in 1909, and that was 30 years beforehand, you know? But what something is, now this guy Homer Lee, again, it's a typically American story. So he's from Colorado, he's from Denver, okay? And they have a Chinese servant in the house. And so he learns everything about China, he's fascinated by China, and he's also somewhat of a genius. The problem is he's physically handicapped, he's a hunchback. And so he tries to get into West Point and they won't let him in. So he becomes a student of military history. So obviously when he wrote that book in 1909, he never was in the military, but he was picked up by circles of the United States military, you know, because he was so brilliant to put the book out, etc. But then what he does is he finds out about what Sun Yat-sen is doing. And especially when the shooting part of the war breaks out, you know, when there's various scuffles, because there's various attempts by Sun to actually overthrow the Manchu government and create the republic, which failed, right? He takes all the money that he has, everything he has, and he goes to Hawaii for a series of secret meetings with Sun Yat-sen and these guys who are also the resistors inside China that Sun works with. And basically, their idea is he's gonna help create an army for them. And one of the reformers, Kang Yue, actually declares him a lieutenant general in this new Chinese army. So he does become a general in this new China. And these are pictures. This is Eagle Rock, California, right? Now what happens is you have a whole bunch of U.S. military people that then are brought in, right, and are to train Chinese people here in the United States in military tactics, combat, etc., right? As part of this thing. Isn't that amazing? I mean, think about that, right? And that's one of the training sections in Eagle Rock, California. This is the militia unit in Fresno. The mayor of Los Angeles, I just forget his name for the moment, but he's also part of this network. He made sure that during the, whatever parade it was, I don't remember, July 4th, et cetera, that the Chinese military guys trained by the Americans had a big front place, you know, in marching in the parade. And that's how the Sun's Nationalist Army was created. Anyway, it's just a wild story. It even gets wilder. But anyway, the upshot of the whole thing is 100 years ago, Monday, the dynasty, the empire fell. And for the first time, a Republic of China was established with the President Sun Yat-sen. And then, whoops. Oh no. Uh-oh. Oh, there we go. Anyway. This is supposed to go. It's not working.
Okay.
This is a little movie here, but it's not playing. It's actually a video. Anyway, it's a celebration of the Chinese Revolution in San Francisco. It's a parade. You can see everybody marching to the parade. For some reason, it's not going. So. Anyway. Okay. Anyway, so. Oh boy. All right. This is the. I don't know how much time to really show this, but anyway, so what Sun Yat-sen does is he establishes the United States on what he calls Samanchuyi, or the three principles of the people. And he basically takes Lincoln's, from the Gettysburg Address, conception of government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and these become the three principles of the people. And the Samanchuyi is a whole series of lectures that he gives to the leadership in China. And they're very involved, where he goes through this. But, so government of the people is national sovereignty, Minzu, Mintron, self-government, right? There's government of the people. And then this is the most importantly, which is Minsheng, and that is people's livelihood, that is for the people, economy, physical economy, which is really the centerpiece of everything that he does. So here you have the United States under the thumb of the British. We're roped into World War I, right? So who's leading the fight now for these ideas of the American Revolution in 1917 in the world? A Chinese guy, okay? Sun Yat-sen. He writes this book in 1917 called The Vital Problem of China. I love this quote, and there's a lot of others in this book. But the book is about why China should not join any of these powers, these European powers, in this war, that it's all complete garbage. We should just stay out of it completely. And in the section on Britain, he says, Britain seeks friendship only with those which can render her services. And when her friends are too weak to be of any use to her, they must be sacrificed in her interests. Britain's tender regard for her friends is like the delicate care usually shown by farmers in their rearing of silkworms. After all the silk has been drawn from the cocoons, they are destroyed by fire or used as food for fish. The present friends of Britain are no more than silkworms, and they are receiving the tender care of Britain simply because there is still some silk left in them. So, anyway, you get the idea. But, so what Sun does is he puts back on the table this transcontinental Eurasian land bridge idea, and in 1919 he releases what's called the International Development of China, which is an extensive development of the entire railroad and infrastructure and ports, etc., of China itself, but as part of a new Eurasian system. All right, so he puts that on the table. It's in 1919 because he puts this out. He says, this has to be the basis of the post-war World War I world. Right? This is a map. This is his map, and it's completely detailed. This is like ready to go. You could start I mean, he's got all the specs done for the ports, the harbors, the canal systems, where the ports are going to be, where the rail lines go, right? And he says this in the introduction: regarded from the principle of the most suitable position, our projected railways will command the most determining position of world importance. It will form a part of the trunk line of the Eurasian system, which will connect the two populous centers, Europe and China, together. It will be the shortest line from the Pacific coast to Europe. Its branch from Ely, which is in northwestern China, will connect with the future Indo-European line through Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. Will link up with the future African system. And then there will be a thorough route from our projected port to Cape Town, which is, of course, South Africa. There's no existing railway commanding such a world importance as this. So he's basically laying out everything that we were talking about in terms of the... Set map back. There it is. Okay. So you see, so this here would be the railroad across China, and of course it doesn't end there. Right, it keeps going, right, across Russia to Europe, down to Cape Town, etc. But what he says about this, and this is the important part, he says unless we do this, and unless these conceptions of economics are addressed, especially regarding China, he says, another world war. Yeah, he says, this will basically end this idea of internecine warfare, become nations around commercial war, bad competition, etc. He said, thus the root of war will be forever exterminated as far as China is concerned, but unless the Chinese question can be settled peacefully, another world war greater and more terrible than the one just passed will be inevitable. And he was right, because this wasn't done, right? This was not done, obviously. And I don't have time to show this, but this is the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So 30 years after Homer Lee's book comes out, they bombed Pearl Harbor. What a surprise, right? But we had FDR by that point. So it's a big difference, right? A student of Hamilton, the American Revolution. You could go down in 1940 to your post office and spend 5 cents and buy this stamp, right? And it shows Lincoln and Sun Yat-sen as three principles of the people in Chinese, other people, by the people, for the people in English. There's a video here, but I don't think we should take the time to show it, but you can, yes.
Billy Mitchell
Yes,
in
I
the
know.
20s
You're absolutely right. Yes, I know.
predicted Pearl Harbor.
I know.
There was
Okay.
for it.
I know, you're right, absolutely right. Yeah. I just don't have time to go through you. Billy Mitchell was part of what
Yeah, he's part of this whole thing.
Anyway, the video is from the Why We Fight series that was done by Frank Capra. Has anybody seen these?
No.
This was done by the War Department under Marshall to educate American troops on what we were fighting for. And this is the one from China. And it's just delightful. It's footage of Sun Yat-sen. It talks about Confucius in that quote. It has this in it, right? So it's all there. This is not that long ago. So this is what
Why we fight, by who?
What's that?
Why we fight?
Why We Fight. Yes, it's series. There's one on Russia. There's one
Capra, I
on...
think he said. She said by
It's Frank Capra, the famous movie producer. Although it's a U.S. information agency film. It's a cover. All of them are online in HD on YouTube. Anyway.
Military.
Let's finish. Come on, we can talk.
And then Why We Fight.
We're just running up against time. Okay, this is 70 years later. Because of course we win World War II, FDR dies, and then you get Trumanism and the Cold War and all this crap. Okay, right? Absolute crap. And until Lyndon LaRouche comes along in the late 60s, nobody's representing this, and then he picks it up. And this is 1989, and this is our history here in New York on this. That's me right there. And all these people have passed away except him. It's Charles Hughes. Anyway, this is around the time after the Berlin Wall came down. So we were out there with our signs with Martin Luther King, Lincoln, and Sun Yat-sen. The dream is still alive. One free China, one free Germany. So we wanted to bring this into the Chinese community, obviously. But that was part of something much larger, which is LaRouche's initiative. And this is especially right after Tiananmen Square, but also after the fall of the Berlin Wall, etc., where we see this says the can't really read that, can you? The Sun Yat-sen program in China's development today. We put this out in 1989. Now Chinese people didn't really know anything about this. Some of the Taiwan people did, but generally people didn't know anything about it. So we put out this extensive program. This is the Chinese version with an article that I wrote. We had a Chinese language version of the EIR magazine. So we distribute this stuff all over the planet to Chinese-speaking people. And we didn't really know why, but we would put this stuff out and they would get it like this. It wasn't even a question. And of course, what we just went through, you can see why. It's just part of the whole history, right? So that by 1996, when they have their conference in China on the Eurasian land bridge, one of the invited speakers is Helga LaRouche. And we put out the Eurasian land bridge report in 97. That's the Chinese version language, or Chinese language version, sorry. This is in New York in 97. In Chinatown, we had this extraordinary meeting.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we had like 200 people there. We had a city councilman there. It was awesome, right? It was all on the Silk Road and the Eurasian language. That was coverage in the World Journal, the Chinese newspaper. There's Helga. This says the Silk Road Lady. She became known throughout the Chinese-speaking world as the Silk Road Lady. This is the lady reviving the Silk Road and the Eurasian land bridge. Anyway, this is just a few of what are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles covering LaRouche in the Chinese language press from New York and all over, actually. So what this led to directly, and we had a big role to play in this, is that Clinton, you know, and certain elements of the institution of the presidency said, okay, we have to have this China-U.S. partnership. They had the wherewithal to realize that. And this led to Clinton's trip to China in 1998. And this alliance with Jiang Zemin. And inside the mainland, this is fascinating, and I'm skipping a lot of stuff because this has been a 20-year project that we've been working on. But you have now the ascension of the presidencies. This is the current president of China, Hu Jintao. Hu Jintao is a Sun Yat-sen scholar. Now this is not typical for someone in mainland communist China. You know, there's supposed to be enemies, the nationalists versus the communists, etc. And so what he did on the 150th anniversary of Sun Yat-sen's birthday is he organized a huge conference in Beijing on Sun Yat-sen, which he addressed, right? So this whole thing with the communists, it's all breaking down as these ideas of LaRouche and the American system, etc., begin to come back into focus. So all these divisions are going to simply melt away into nothing. That's the current Eurasian land bridge. That is the policy, official policy of the Chinese government. And of course, these developments that we've seen over the last weeks with Putin. This is our candidate in California, Summer Shields. And he's speaking from Chinatown. He's got this wonderful little Chinese costume on. And that's one of his posters. That's the Tian Shao Wei Gong, right? That we saw, that's the Chinese of it. All under heaven for the people is the literal translation. That's the stamp. This says, Lincoln and Sun Yat-sen is the spirit that will carry us forward today. And then this is, he's running for office, so it says vote for Summer Shields, right? That's the old poster from the last election. But on Monday, we're having a major conference in San Francisco. We have an extensive thing there going on with the Chinese community. Some people familiar with what we've done on Nawapa will remember the interviews with the engineer Howard Chang. That is, what's happening is, well, actually, we'll get to that. But what's happening is that the spirit of optimism of the United States of America is being brought back in through these Chinese networks. But it's not really Chinese, it's the American Revolution, as we saw from the history. That's the beauty of it, right? So we're down for a moment, so they're going to come in and say, okay, we'll help you guys out, you know. We'll bring you back to life again. You know, you did it for us, we'll do it for you. This is the Arctic Conference that was referred to in the video. And this is the map that we use showing the new Pacific Center development with the Bering Straits. And there's our friend, Senator Seward. That's his dream, right? Dream comes alive. And I just want to end with this. This is the head of the Chinese space program. Someone asked him, well, what are you guys doing this for, you know? What do you want to do, militarize space? You know? He said, no. He said, the Chinese nation has pursued peace since ancient times. China's ultimate intention with the space program is to explore space resources and make use of them for mankind's well-being. And that is their intention. And what happened is, after they launched the Tiangong that was referred to in the video. This is on the 29th of September. And so what they did is they put on CCTV, China National Television, a video simulation of it, either before, during, or after. And it caused somewhat of a, you know, an explosion, because this is what it was. What's the music in the background? Now this is the actual launch. I'll just throw the first couple minutes of it because it's a riot. Counting down in China. my conclusion here. Yes, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but you have to build it. Just by the way, that thing with the America the Beautiful,
Yeah.
there was I saw it online, it was one of the astronomy or science magazines saying, this is really strange. And then they quote a guy from the London Guardian. They asked him, what's up with this? He goes, well, we're not quite sure if it's a message by the Chinese that they want a trans-Pacific alliance now. He uses that term, right? Or it's just a mistake. Somebody's saying there, it's a
It was a
gas.
mistake. They're not that smart. They don't know what they're doing.
So, anyway, it's obviously very deliberate.
Yeah.
I think with this, with what China is doing, with collaborating with Russia. Remember when we wrote back in Berlin wrote when he was in prison. Fall of 1990, which I keep referring to, which is interesting to me. Fall of 1993, he writes in Paderson, History of Science,
Yeah.
America 2000, where he's going through specifically the breakdown after the Berlin Wall came down. What happened then? What happened with Russia and so forth, being looted and so forth? And I keep looking at that, and the Chinese kept looking at all these developments and so forth, and they're like, we're not gonna go with that. We're not gonna go with that. And now you see what they did as far as them holding out and so forth. You know, we had fights with them and so forth to do things. And and then was having fights with the Russians also. But for the Chinese to hold out and then later on, to have the Russians to now wake up and now collaborate with the Chinese was interesting.
Well, what happened is, remember when LaRouche, one of the reasons that I don't know all the details, but one of the principal reasons that it was absolutely vital on behalf of anybody that really had any idea of what the world was to get LaRouche out of jail was because of his work with Russia and his involvement with the SDI and the tremendous respect that he had among the resistors, the science people, etc., inside the former Soviet Union, which had fallen by that point. And you had some people around Clinton that understood that and made sure LaRouche got out of jail. And so when all those guys came here, I don't know if people remember, or those that were around then, we had a conference in Virginia, and all these Russian guys showed up. It was like right after LaRouche came out of jail. And then he went to Russia, and a whole series of seminars, etc. Yeah. And what the Russians said to LaRouche after he presented these ideas and this and that, and here's my infrastructure plan, and they said, you gotta go to China. I'll love this. Go to China. Get into China on that one, right? Because they understood how the Chinese thought about this. So it always was. You can't separate any of these three: the United States, Russia, China. It's part of the transformation of the world coming out of the American Revolution. Yes.
How much time did Sun Yat-sen actually spend in the United States?
Well, actually, he was here because they couldn't. There was also schemes by some of these Americans to get money. They tried to go to some Wall Street people, get chunks of money, and none of it ever worked. So most of what he did is he was raising money on these trips. So in 1911, when Wu Chang fell, he wasn't in China, he was in San Francisco raising money. So I don't know how much at the percentage of the time that he spent in the United States versus these other places. It's a lot, though.
Was he fluent in English?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And there's a big, in fact, they have the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association of New York right here on Mott Street. They're very proud of this history because Sun Yat-sen was there, a few times. And they have they used to anyway, I don't know if it's still, they have a photographic display with the old photos. And there's stories, I've read these stories where he would go to these very poor Chinatowns and he'd have people come up with them. A man would come up with a sock, filled with like pennies, or whatever the equivalent was, and say, Dr. Sun, this is all I have. This is my entire life savings. I want to give it to you. Right? So this was a real movement. This is the real deal.